This conference will now be recorded.
Great. Welcome, Wes. We really appreciate you coming.
Oh, yeah, of course.
The agenda is going to be pretty short. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the legislative, get a good update from you all, what's going on, whoever would like to go first, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do in the coming months. So I am open to, Lauren, since you came first, why don't we let you go first? How's that?
Okay. So thanks very much for organizing this and for everyone attending. I appreciate your time. I will mention, I think there were a couple of people who maybe didn't get the follow-up Zoom, so we're trying to get that information to them. But if I know there were a lot of elected officials who wanted to attend, so hopefully we'll be able to loop them in, or they'll be able to catch up with you all another time.
Sure.
So it was a most unusual session. I'm getting sick of saying that. I feel like every year there is something that that is out of the ordinary, but that's especially true now. And I hope that we never see another year like this one. And so session started in January, and it proceeded pretty normally. There were a number of contentious and high-profile issues that the Senate leadership managed to navigate pretty successfully. So there was SJR 38, which is the GOP leadership's and supermajority's attempt to repeal some of the voter-approved redistricting reforms included in Clean Missouri. So that was obviously a very controversial and contentious issue, but it managed to pass the Senate early in the year. There were other issues along the same lines, including PDMP. So, but we got through all of that without the Senate blowing up, and so I think people were hopeful that we were going to be able to get to some pretty substantive legislation and things that we all filed that would help our constituents. Obviously, in mid-March, there were people started talking about the seriousness of the coronavirus and the pandemic. Right before our planned legislative break, we talked about extending that, but the night before we recessed or adjourned temporarily, I don't think any of us realized that it was going to be for several weeks. And so there was a break from mid-March until the end of April. During that time, I heard from constituents who lost their jobs, who were struggling to file for unemployment. I heard from small business owners who were struggling to keep their doors open. So and I am not confident that we're out of the woods, even though we saw an optimistic report this morning. I think the effects could be long-term, and so I'm keeping an eye on that. And actually this morning was working with the Department of Economic Development on some proposed guidance for a line item that I worked with Wes Rogers on. We were able to secure $30 million for small business assistance and loans, and so now we're working with the department on figuring out what that grant program looks like. So all of that is to say, we came back at the end of April, and unfortunately, instead of focusing on the response to the coronavirus, I think a lot of people instead wanted to condense an entire session down into 3 weeks, and it was an imperfect process. We tried to slow down the legislation as much as possible. But there were a lot of omnibus bills, and unfortunately, like I said, a lot of what passed is not in direct response to the crises we're facing currently. So a couple of high-profile issues. The supermajorities did pass their SJR 38, so voters will weigh in on redistricting again in November. Some of the major proposed changes to that, you might remember under Clean Missouri, they in drawing the maps and in creating districts, there are a number of criteria that that are prioritized. And towards the top of the list are things like competitiveness, so partisan competitiveness, and there, in contrast, the new proposed changes would prioritize things like compactness. And so under Clean Missouri, they count the number of people included in districts the way that every state has done since our nation's history. And under this new proposal, SJR 38, which some of us call Dirty Missouri, they would totally change the way that districts, that population is counted, and would allow for things like excluding children from being counted or non-citizens from being counted, even though as legislators, we should be responsive to anyone who lives in the district. So that's one of the major issues. We did discuss Wayfair on a number of these calls. I've been asked about the status of Wayfair, which is the collection of the online sales tax or use tax. So I think there is broad support to pass a version of Wayfair. The main sticking point is the fact that this would bring in additional revenue. I would argue this is revenue that we should have always collected. As you know, it puts our brick and mortar stores at a disadvantage when they're competing against these online retailers who are not collecting that sales tax. And after we've just asked them to close for several months or weeks in the interest of public health, I think it's really unfair to our local brick and mortar stores to put them at that disadvantage. So there is broad support for passing Wayfair, but because it would generate additional revenue that we should have always been collecting, there are a number of Republican senators, especially, who want to see additional income sales tax or income tax cuts that correspond with that. And so I think that's a hard pill for a lot of us to swallow. They also have proposed things that would harm our local municipalities and their ability to collect some of that revenue. So I would like to see a clean version of Wayfair pass, but other legislators have used it to leverage their priorities, and other interest groups have also tried to get in on that discussion. So right now, we haven't been able to find a compromise, even though we've worked on one for years and years and years, but that is the main sticking point. I've heard the possibility that there may be a special session called to address that. I don't know if we'll see that, but it is something that we will continue to work on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lauren. That sounds good. John, welcome. I see you just joined with us, so thank you.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Yes. Hey, Wes, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, sure. And generally, I don't have a ton to add to what Senator Arthur said, but anecdotally, I'll say two things. One, on SJR 38, when we're talking about redistricting, the best example of the way we're doing things not working very well is Clay County. One of the things that I love about Clay County is that it is one of the last purple counties in the state. There's a lot of competitive races at the countywide level, but when we get to the state house seats, this last election, we didn't have a single state house race determined by fewer than 10 points. And I think that's a pity. In a purple county, we ought to have competitive house races. So that's just one thing I would add to what Senator Arthur said. On the Wayfair piece of this, coming at it more as a small business owner, which I am, than a politician, and that's that the way we're doing things now, and Senator Arthur spoke on this too, it's a real disadvantage to somebody. We sell commercial dishwashers, and you pay a pretty penny for sales tax on a commercial dishwasher. And if somebody can go out of state and buy it for cheaper than you can buy it from a brick and mortar store here, that's really doing a disservice to our Missouri small businesses. So, we need to quit talking about that like it's a new tax. What we need to do is apply the taxes we already have fairly, particularly where it's fair to our own small businesses. And I don't have anything in addition to what Senator Arthur's already said besides that.
Okay, wonderful. John, we've just kind of gone around the horn to talk and give updates on what you guys have learned. And then I'd like to open it up for questions from the group. This is our first virtual meeting, so I hope to see more folks joining us as we go through this, but we need to get started, and so welcome, everybody. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. Yeah, and when you say talk about what we've learned, is that what you said?
Yeah. What changes? What's going on? What's new?
Okay. So, and I apologize for missing Senator Arthur's comments. So I'm not sure what all she covered. Obviously, the governor just signed the elections bill. I assume you talked about that. Okay, so that set forth a plan to allow folks to vote. Obviously, this is a strange time and challenging time with the coronavirus. And so it's set up if you're 65 or older, you can vote absentee without needing an excuse. Also, if you have one of a number of health conditions that I guess the legislature considered made you at high risk, that also qualified you to vote. For folks under 65, you've probably seen, but you're going to have to get your ballot notarized. I think there are going to be challenges around that, making sure people have full access to, free notaries so that it doesn't essentially become a poll tax in essence for folks who want to exercise that right and are rightly concerned about going and standing in line at a poll on election day. So, I think we should have done better on that front. I think we should have passed a bill that allowed no absentee voting for everybody, and allowed everybody to request a mail-in ballot be sent to them. So I think there are going to be challenges around that, and we're going to have to stay on top of it. I heard discussion just now about Wayfair. That's a common sense, easy reform that we ought to pass. I guess there's been some rumor about having a special session at some point, and could that be one of the issues discussed? I sure hope it is. If so, I've been encouraging folks in Jeff City to stay focused on the pandemic, on both the health and economic challenges that it poses. Wayfair would be the only thing that I would think could sort of fall outside of that, although it is connected in that people are doing more online shopping, and we're also facing revenue shortfalls, and Wayfair would help to offset that, obviously. But for the most part, I think, to the extent that we go back in a special session, I think we ought to stay focused on addressing the pandemic. It's killed 110,000 people, and 40 million people are out of work. You all know the facts, but it really can't be overstated how serious this moment in history is. And I think there are a lot of things that we can and should be doing, and happy to talk about those. But in terms of what actually passed, again, I'm not sure what all Senator Arthur talked about, but I'm happy to answer questions. I guess might be an easier way to do this going forward. So.
Okay, I'll open it up. Who would like to ask a question?
I've got a little bit of a clarifying question for Senator Arthur. What you were saying about SJR 38, I wasn't quite clear. Are you saying that the struggle to get that enacted is still ongoing, or that it's secure at this point, or what is the exact status there?
Sure, thank you for that question. So So it passed the legislature, and since it's done that, it will now go to voters to be voted on in November. And it would have the effect of, if it passed in November, then it would replace what voters approved in 2018 with Clean Missouri. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
That really
I
was
had those two. Yeah, I'm new to Kansas City, so I had those two switched around. I thought SGR was the good one and clean was the bad one. So I appreciate that clarification.
Yeah, thank you.
And can I just add on cleanup? Did you guys talk about how they're changing total population?
I referenced it, but it would be great if you expanded on it.
Well, yeah, I would just add that in addition to repealing what the voters passed 2 years ago, which in my view is an outrageous thing enough to do, it also would change the way that population has been counted, the way people have been counted up in order to draw district lines. From the entire history of the United States of America, both of the federal government and every state in the country has always, in doing these populations, has always done total population. So every man, woman, and child who lives in the state, just like they do with the census, and then they divide it up accordingly. Since the founding of the country, that's always how it's been done. And now, for the first time, if this were to pass, they've inserted language in there to only include eligible voters as people in the population. So children, non-citizens, legal permanent residents, all of them would no longer be counted under the bill. And it's actually a very radical departure from 231 years of history, and is the even more, for me, the even more concerning piece of the change. I'm frankly shocked that they did it, but they did, and it's going to be up to the voters to decide if that's what we want to do, and I hope we don't.
Okay. Good. Dave, do you have a question for the group? Mr. Mecklenburg?
No, I have no questions. This has been very informative. Thank you.
Yes. Alan, anything for the group?
Nothing for me.
All right. I've got just one question. When do you see the Wayfair being put in place for Missouri? What's your best guess? All three of you. What's your best guess as to when that'll become a reality? Did you hear me?
Yeah. Did you say when do we think it'll pass?
Yep. When will it become a reality?
Well, Lauren, you're in the Senate. You tell us.
Well, that's what I was going to say. There are a number of important elections that will take place in both August and November that will determine the heart of the Senate in some ways, the direction that the Senate will head in, whether it's, and there are, just to, not to bore anyone, but the dynamics of the Senate are really interesting at this moment. There are Democrats, and we're in the super minority with, I think we have 10 members right now. And then the Republicans hold the rest of the seats, but within the Republican supermajority, we've broken down into two factions. There are 6 members, and sometimes it's 7, and sometimes it's 5, depending on the issue. There's a group of 6 members who call themselves the Conservative Caucus, and then the remaining Republicans tend to be a more traditional type of Republican. And so there has been a lot of caucus infighting among those two groups, or between those two groups. And the Conservative Caucus is the group that demands that there be offsetting tax cuts. if we pass a version of Wayfair. And so if that group grows in the next election, and there are a number of members who would run as part of that conservative caucus, so if that group grows, then they'll have more leverage. It will be more difficult to pass a version of Wayfair without that revenue being dedicated instead to those income tax cuts. If the conservative caucus shrinks next year, then it's possible that we could pass a version of Wayfair that dedicates that money to something like roads and bridges or rainy day fund, or just sends it back to general revenue. So they've been trying to thread that really thin needle, and so that's kind of where we are. And I think the elections in November, well, and really mostly the elections in August will play a big role in determining when we can pass a Wayfair bill and what it looks like.
Okay. I don't have a camera. You'd see me nodding. I'm sorry. I'm just kind of thinking through what you said. Wes, any comments on that? John, any other comments on that?
I'm the rookie in this group, and so I'll defer to Senator Arthur and Representative Carpenter because they've been doing this a lot longer than I have, as far as any kind of timeline on Wayfair.
Yeah, I it's hard to predict. Missouri often falls behind in a lot of these public policy discussions. Is it the case that we're now the only state that hasn't done this on this? Okay, yeah, that it's sort of a running joke that that's true on a lot of issues, and sadly, it seems to be true here again. What I would say is the demand being made is that there's this big offset, right? That for every dollar of whatever projected new revenue would come in through internet sales tax collection needs to be offset with corporate tax cuts or income tax cuts. That, of course, would disproportionately benefit higher earning folks, or in some cases, out-of-state corporations. And, we're just going to have to, those of us who support Wayfair, although, it won't be me going forward, but are going to have to just oppose that, because there's really no justification for taking whatever new revenue would come in through people, everyday citizens making purchases online, and then handing that money away in the form of some kind of corporate or income tax cut. First of all, we have significant revenue shortfalls in Missouri, as I think everybody on the call probably knows, and that predated COVID-19 and all the significant additional challenges that that's going to pose. And so we really can't afford. It would be an unwise decision to do that, and it also would be unfair, in my view, to ask everyday people to start paying more than they're currently paying through sales tax collections, which they ought to be paying anyway. I totally agree with that. But then to take that money and immediately turn around and give it away in the form of corporate or income tax cuts, I think would be deeply unfair. And so, how are we going to get the conversation to a place where folks in the conservative caucus are willing to vote for Wayfair without that second piece attached to it? Other than having brilliant people like Senator Arthur over there changing hearts and minds, and then community engagement, folks like the folks who are on this call reaching out and doing what they can do. And then obviously politically, when it comes to November elections and August elections, that can make a difference too. But unfortunately, sometimes fortunately, but often unfortunately in the Senate, individual members and especially small groups of members can have sort of outsized influence and can really gum up the works if they want to. And currently that's the case with this issue. So.
Okay, great. If I see that you just joined, do you have some questions for the group?
It's possible that Deb's audio
Okay.
Doesn't work. It looks
Okay.
like she's joined by phone, but I'm not sure that she'll be able to chat. I do
Okay.
see a question from Paul, though, in the chat.
Yep.
He says, my internet connection is a little choppy, so I'll ask here. What are your thoughts on local police department control? And then a comment, thank you, Senator Arthur, for addressing my earlier question about absentee voter concerns.
I'll say I support Kansas City getting local control back, have for many years. I think the current situation really shows why that's necessary. While other cities and mayors and councils and police departments have been able to be agile in responding to the current challenges, have been able to not only hear the demands of protesters, but also make significant and serious attempts to take those conversations and do something about them. It's obviously a lot harder for leaders, our locally elected leaders in Kansas City, to do that. Same thing. And I don't think it's been justified for a long time, probably decades, to have state control of the police department. But especially now, when the people are asking us to act, asking locally elected leaders to act, they ought to be able to do so, and they ought not have to get permission from folks at the state level to do that. And so I'll definitely encourage everybody in the House and the Senate to support moving in that direction.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Any other questions, Paul? Did that answer, or anybody else want to speak on that?
Yeah, I'll add, and thank you for the question, Paul. I know we've corresponded through writing, but it's nice to see your face. I will just add as a reminder that there are two ways to return local control. There's through the legislature and the governor. And St. Louis tried to lobby the legislature for a number of years to return local control, and those efforts were unsuccessful, even though it had major buy-in from those stakeholders. And so they went the second route, which is through initiative petition, and they put it on the ballot. They sent it to all Missouri voters, and voters approved the return of local control. So there are two options. I will say this is an issue where I would support local control, with the caveat that I want to make sure that that's the consensus among our city council members, with the mayor, with our local community, that they want to see that change made. I know Councilwoman Robinson passed a resolution that allowed for a study of that issue. I think the issue has probably been studied in the past, but there is renewed interest. But in order for something like that, which is a very heavy lift, in order for it to pass successfully and be implemented successfully, I think it's going to take broad coalition and major consensus among stakeholders. And so if there is that will and that push, then I would be supportive.
Yeah, and I would just add, and I agree with what's already been said, but I'll add a similar issue we discussed in the legislature this year was, right now we have a residency requirement for Kansas City police officers, and there was an attempt to try to remove that this last session. Representative from St. Charles was the one that was pushing that on the House floor, and the whole time I kept thinking, I don't even, and I frankly can kind of see both sides of that argument, but I was just appalled that somebody from St. Charles was trying to drive the bus on policy in our city. So there are a lot of issues related to our police department that are really important, that are going to affect how it looks going forward. And the bottom line is Kansas Cityans and our leaders need to figure out what's best for us, not somebody from St. Charles.
We have a question in the chat here from Deb Herman on the subject of local control. She asks, how will KC be safer with local control? How would that have changed what has occurred?
But yeah, I mean, I think in part it would allow, like I like I said, it would allow the locally elected leadership to be more agile in responding to the ongoing situation. Look, people are out there making their voices heard, and whatever you think of the methods or the demands, etc. Most other cities, in fact, I think every other major city in this country, their locally elected leadership is able to respond and to make decisions accordingly. And I think it does hamper our locally elected leaders, our mayor and our council, from both hearing what the protesters have to say and then taking actually being able to tell them, okay, here's what we're going to do based upon, we've heard you, and here's what we're going to do. And I think by not having that ability to the extent that other cities have, I think it makes it more of a challenge to deal with the civil unrest and with the very, in my view, the very justified concerns that people have about the way, equitable treatment in the criminal justice system and with policing. And so how does it make it safer? That's a big question. And I'm not sure that I have the answer to that, but I do feel confident that our locally elected leaders can navigate these issues just like leaders in every other city do. And I'm also confident that if we don't return this power to the city, that the unrest and the discontent that you see amongst so many members of the public is going to be harder to address at the local level. And I sure don't want to wait on folks that Governor Parson or others put in charge of this. I don't have a lot of faith in, I have more faith in our locally elected leaders, so I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it is a helpful reminder that the accountability exists with the Senate and their ability to confirm appointments, but those are appointments made by the governor. And if there were more local control, if maybe the mayor appointed those board members, and there are different models for what local control would look like, but it would allow at least a more direct response for Kansas City voters on whether or not they approve of those decisions and who's representing and serving on that local board.
Okay, thank you. One, I want to thank you all for the time you've given to us to do this. I really always love having this update because you guys come with such good information, and I really appreciate the time you've spent with us. This is a real luxury to have the opportunity to have all three of you here to talk, and we look forward to doing this maybe again this fall to try to see what's going on and just be able to stay up to date. I do want to go over the next few months, just so everybody knows kind of what we're going to be working toward. At this moment, July, we've scheduled off, but we'll talk about that and maybe have something around the COVID. But for now, we're off July. August, we'll have the census come in and talk about the numbers and see kind of what they're experiencing and how we might be able to help. Then we'll have a discussion around the airport, so get a status update on the new changes at the airport. In October, we've got the chief coming to talk, as well as in November, we'll have at the North Kansas City School District come and talk. That'll be about the right time for their surveys and so forth to come out. So we'll know a little bit more about what's going on with the schools and how well they're performing. And then in December, right now we've got it scheduled for the mayor to come and talk. So we've got a calendar to the end of the year with some plans, but please know they may change, and we look forward to meeting on a monthly basis. We will continue to do it on Friday at noon. So please mark your calendars. We'd love to have you, and please invite friends to come and join. So thank you. Any other comments for the good of the group?
I'll just again say thanks for the time and for convening this meeting. The last thing I'll mention, right now the governor has had to make withholds amounting to I think about $430 million. And so that is going to be a concern going forward. And if you have a relationship with our congressional delegation, I'd urge you to reach out to them and discuss the need to help some of our state with its financial commitments, but also some of our local municipalities who are going to also struggle. And again, I'm hopeful that we'll see that today marks a return back to some sort of normalcy, but I am a little cynical, and I'm really concerned about if we've already had to cut almost $500 million from the budget, the kinds of impact we'll see in our community next year if we continue along that path.
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay. I've had a few folks just join us. Who do I have on the call? Caller 6.
This is Mary DeShonick.
Hey, Mary.
Hey, Ed.
Hey. And then who just called right in before Mary? Caller 5.
Might be me. I can't really see because I can't see a screen.
Thank you.
Terry.
All right. Thanks, Terry. Great. Okay. Any questions for the new callers that have come in? Any questions that we should ask our elected officials here?
No, I'm sorry I was late, but thank you all for coming.
Yes, most definitely. Thank you, Terry. That's great. Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap up unless someone has something else they'd like to talk about. All right. I will go ahead and close out the meeting, and thank you all for coming. I do appreciate your time, and the insights are wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a very good weekend. Talk to you later.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.